et bonsoir à toutes. Bonsoir à chacune et chacun d'entre vous. Merci beaucoup d'être avec nous ce soir. Je suis donc Cécile Duflot, la directrice générale d'Oxfam France, et j'ai le plaisir et l'honneur d'introduire et de modérer cette conférence intitulée « Inflation, pandémie, climat, l'urgence de la fiscalité progressive » organisée par l'ICRICT, la commission en français indépendante pour une réforme internationale de la fiscalité. Merci de m'avoir offert ce rôle. Cette conférence a lieu en coopération avec la Fondation Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, l'Observatoire européen de la fiscalité et Oxfam international. Un remerciement tout particulier aussi à l'École d'économie de Paris qui nous accueille ce soir pour ce moment partagé avec vous, tous qui êtes donc nombreux dans cette petite salle, mais aussi tous ceux et toutes celles qui nous regardent depuis leur écran. L'ICRICT, c'est un groupe de leaders économiques et politiques du monde entier, né en 2015, qui soutient la nécessité, l'urgence et l'opportunité de transformer radicalement la manière dont les multinationales sont taxées. Et c'est un grand plaisir pour moi d'accueillir aujourd'hui deux membres de l'ICRICT, la professeure Jayati Ghosh et le professeur Joseph Stiglitz, qui viennent tous deux d'accepter de prendre la coprésidence de l'ICRICT après la nomination de José Antonio Ocampo comme ministre des Finances en Colombie. Merci donc à tous et à toutes les membres de l'ICRICT pour votre travail, votre énergie et vos contributions au débat fiscal, en particulier en ce moment de crise très spécifique. Cette crise, ou plutôt cette succession de crises, ou plutôt ce grand basculement, a exacerbé les inégalités, comme le montrait Oxfam dans son rapport annuel sur l'état des inégalités en janvier dernier. D'un côté, les milliardaires se sont plus enrichis sur les 2 dernières années que lors de la décennie précédente. Et cela est particulier puisque c'est grâce, en très large partie, à l'intervention publique. Des entreprises ont réalisé des bénéfices jamais vus en surfant sur la crise, et de l'autre, 263 millions de personnes devraient basculer dans la pauvreté sous l'effet combiné de la crise du Covid et de la vie chère. Si rien n'est fait, les plus précaires devraient être frappés les premiers par l'inflation. Voilà pourquoi nous nous retrouvons ce soir, parce que face à ces crises, les États ont beaucoup dépensé, parfois sans compter, pour limiter les dégâts. Certains même dépensent toujours, et nous sommes un certain nombre à avoir pensé que c'était une bonne chose, mais se pose aujourd'hui, de fait, la question de savoir qui va payer la facture. Les États ont le choix, ils peuvent opter, on l'a entendu, le débat a lieu en France, mais il a lieu dans beaucoup d'autres pays, pour des programmes d'austérité, notamment en continuant à utiliser l'outil de la réduction du financement des services publics, le relèvement de l'âge de la retraite, le débat est sur la table en France, au détriment des plus vulnérables, ou ils peuvent décider de faire contribuer une partie de ceux ou tous ceux qui ont profité de la crise et qui n'ont pas jusqu'à présent payé leur juste part, les multinationales et les super riches. Faire payer la crise aux plus précaires, nous considérons que ça n'est pas une fatalité, qu'il existe des alternatives. Et nous allons discuter aujourd'hui et maintenant de ces alternatives avec nos invités. Dans un premier temps, nous discuterons avec la professeure Jayati Ghosh et le professeur Stiglitz des réponses fiscales à l'inflation. C'est un sujet très chaud et ici, Oxfam est extrêmement mobilisé, en France, oui, mais aussi partout ailleurs, parce que la question de l'imposition structurelle des multinationales est un sujet que nous aborderons également en seconde partie, où participeront également au débat Theresa Neef de l'Observatoire européen de la fiscalité et Pascal Saint-Amans, directeur, ou bientôt, comment on dit, voilà, bientôt ex, mais toujours directeur pour l'instant, et en tout cas grand spécialiste du Centre de politique et d'administration fiscale de l'OCDE, qui a coordonné les travaux du cadre inclusif de l'OCDE sur la réforme internationale de la taxation des multinationales. Cette seconde partie du débat sera modérée par Susanna Ruiz, que je remercie, puisque je devrais vous quitter pour ouvrir un autre événement d'Oxfam qui a lieu exactement en ce moment, la même soirée. Donc je suis désolée, mais je suis quand même très heureuse de pouvoir être avec vous. Et je vous propose donc qu'on commence tout de suite sur ce premier panel avec une question très simple. Est-ce que la fiscalité est une réponse pertinentes face à la crise de l'inflation et à la faible croissance dans notre monde d'après la pandémie. So let me switch to English to introduce my speakers. So I think you can let the translator, I will continue in English. But you can use it for some of you if you need. Can tax make a difference in high inflation, low growth, post-pandemic world? That's our main issue for the moment. So I introduce for a second time the first two speakers. Jayati Ghosh, you are professor of economics at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, School of Social Science, Jawaharlal and Nehru University in New Delhi. And Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate in economics and university professor at Columbia University. You are chief economist at the Roosevelt Institute and a former senior vice president and chief economist at the World Bank. So, Professor Ghosh, let me start with you. We are facing a very severe cost of living crisis on top of a pandemic and climate emergency. The implications are felt globally. The economic consequences are spreading fast, but once again, it is hitting much harder the most vulnerable people in Europe, but not only. Inflation, high debt levels, and large fiscal deficits. What are the real dangers for developing countries during this crisis, and how do we respond?
Well, thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here and be part of this discussion. Yes, you mentioned the cost of living crisis in Europe. And I would just like to say that while this is intense and definitely becoming a major political issue in both the US and Europe, it is really nothing compared to the extreme crisis that most people in the developing world are facing. We are in a perfect storm of multiple crises that are impacting on very, very large populations in the developing world. And this was something that has happened, this perfect storm of the pandemic, followed by this massive price increases after the Ukraine war, is something that came on economies that were already relatively weak. I think it's important to remember that, in fact, there hadn't really been a very significant global recovery since the global financial crisis, other than in a few pockets that everyone notices, like China. That most of the developing world was basically just sort of toddling along. Employment growth had been relatively low. Wage growth had been non-existent in most countries. Then you get, of course, the pandemic, which heightened inequality, certainly because of vaccine inequality, vaccine apartheid, in fact, as it has been called, but also because of very, very different fiscal responses. Most developing countries did not even spend as much as they had spent after the global financial crisis. They spent, on average, the middle-income countries between 4 to 6% of GDP, the poor, low-income countries less than 2% of GDP, compared to the advanced economies, which spent anywhere between 10 to 30% of GDP additional spending. And if you look at the period from between January 2020 and March 2021, the US alone spent in excess of $25,000 per capita on its additional spending. The low-income countries spent $2 per capita additional spending. So that's the kind of difference we're talking about. Obviously, if you spend less, you cannot actually have the same kind of recovery. So we didn't get the same recovery. Employment has not even recovered to pre-pandemic levels in most of our economies. And then you get the impact of the Ukraine war, which is only partly related to supply shortages because of the war. It's also significantly driven by profiteering, financial speculation in commodity markets, which led to dramatic increases in basic and commodity prices, energy prices, which when the speculation boom, this bubble ends, prices are back now to pre-war levels, but they're not back to pre-war levels in most developing countries. Prices are sticky downwards in developing countries. Money wages have fallen in most countries. So we're talking about rising prices of essential goods when money wages have actually fallen, not just remained stagnant. So whatever you want to call it. It's not even stagflation. It's a decline in real incomes of most of the working people. 70% of them are informal workers, okay? And they are facing massively declining living standards, massive increases in undernutrition and in absolute hunger. This is not a situation where we can talk about whether we need more fiscal space or whether a fiscal stimulus is required. It's essential, it's urgent. And yet we cannot do it because global capital markets will punish you the minute you run a large fiscal deficit. And we are finding it harder and harder to get access to debt because some countries are already in debt crisis, others are facing the consequences of being contaminated by the contagion, and therefore their ability to raise debt in global markets has come down. There is really no option but raising revenues. In other words, the options are now so constrained for developing countries that just to survive and to somehow meet this kind of incredible combination of crises, I haven't even mentioned climate change, which is already affecting us. We know about the floods in Pakistan. We don't know so much about the creeping desertification that is affecting large parts of the developing world, including my own country, India, the significant increases in certain pests across Africa, which is affecting agriculture there, which are also impacting lives and livelihoods. We definitely need massive public investment to deal with all of these crises. We need massive increases in social protection. We need investment in resilience. We don't have the money. So there is no option but a dramatic increase in revenues, and that has to happen through increased taxation, because these same countries that I have mentioned to you, you will find aggregate GDP going up because the rich are actually doing all right. In my own country, we tripled the number of dollar billionaires over the pandemic period, and some of our richest have moved into the league of the top richest 50 billion, the 50 richest people in the world, and so on. So the inequalities that have occurred in wealth and in income within our own countries really mean that there is a greater possibility to enforce progressive taxation, but also there is an absolute necessity, because otherwise we are dealing with actually tragedies of catastrophic proportions.
Thank you. We will continue, but now, Professor Stiglitz, let me turn. At the same time, at this situation, corporate profits... Somebody can fix it? Okay. So, at the same time, corporate profits... In the other side? We can share this one, Professor. Yes. I think it's not bad.
To preserve neurons.
No, we will try to share this one. Very sensitive. At the same time, corporate profits in energy, but not only, are registering record high levels. Not every sector, that's true, but not every company, but mainly in large and monopolistic sectors. How is that possible? What can be done? Please, Professor, talk us about the importance of making the corporate tax system more progressive generally, but also on increasing the corporate tax, income tax, rate on monopolies and oligopolies, such as, of course, Google, Netflix, Amazon, Facebook, and etc. I will share my... Okay. Old-fashioned technique.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. First, let me say I agree with everything Jayati said. And let me, before answering your question, focus more narrowly on the United States and Europe, and on the issue of inflation that is behind this discussion. And let me say first that raising interest rates is not going to be the solution to the problem. It's going to exacerbate the problem. And central bankers have a simple model in their mind that whenever there is excess, whenever there's inflation, they're taught to, like a monkey, to raise interest rates. That's what you do when you're a central banker. And if you don't do that, you're criticized. And there are words like, you fall behind the curve, you're going to get punished, the country is going to suffer. The fact is, this is not an ordinary inflation. This is inflation that is caused by the increase by the pandemic. We shut down the economy. You don't do that very often, and then you try to start it again. There are lockdowns in China. There are supply chain problems. And then all of that has been exacerbated by the energy, the war in Ukraine, the energy, the food, fertilizer, all the problems that Jayati mentioned. You ask yourself, if you were just not a trained economist, or particularly not a trained central banker, and you asked yourself, will raising interest rates lead to more food? And your first answer is no. And you ask, will raising interest rates lead to more oil, more gas? The answer is, again, no. And in fact, it's counterproductive, because what you need when you have a supply chain problem or when you have a shortage is to make investment, to reduce the bottleneck. And what we're doing is making it more expensive to make those investments that would reduce the bottlenecks. And in that sense, we're exacerbating the problem. In the United States, we have an additional problem of rents going up. And again, there are many reasons for this that are a little bit complicated. But as all of you know, we have 1 million fewer Americans than we did before the pandemic, because we managed the pandemic so poorly, and we have about 2 million fewer immigrants than we would have had. And so your first blush, the supply of housing is the same, the demand is down because we've been knocking off people. And that should lower rents, but rents are going up. And the understanding of what is going on is a little bit complex, and I can't go into it. But we know that raising interest rates systematically in the past has been associated with an increase in rents. And that will again exacerbate measured inflation. So, and we could go through issues like the price of cars went up. It wasn't because we forgot how to produce cars. It was because there was a shortage of chips. And again, will raising interest rates solve that problem? No. Now, the good news in the United States is overall the pace of inflation has come down markedly. The numbers year over year are still very large, but if you look month over month, they've come down dramatically. Not a surprise, in part because the price of oil, price of gasoline, has come down. But there's still, I don't want to pretend that the problem of inflation has gone away. But the way to resolve that is, as Jayati was saying, more fiscal space. We need to, for instance, one of the problems in the United States is a shortage of labor. Why is there a shortage of labor? Part of the reason there's a shortage of labor is because we treat our workers so badly. And after 2 years in the pandemic, they decided they didn't want to go back to work under those terrible working conditions. So improving working conditions would actually help. But another reason is that unlike France and other civilized countries, we don't have good daycare. We don't have child care. Free child care, and it's very hard to organize it. And that means you are reducing the supply of labor. President Biden wanted to do that as a response, to increase the productivity of our economy, and the Republicans and Manchin said no. So we didn't have that response. Another way would be to open up a little bit more to immigration. But again, that is not politically possible. So there are things within the fiscal space, and there are a whole set of things that we could do to address the supply bottlenecks and the inflation. And if we have time, we can go back and talk about more of them. But they all require more tax revenue. And then the question is, that comes to your question, where do we get the tax revenue? Well, one of the striking things is that while some people have been really suffering since the beginning of the pandemic and are now suffering from the high oil prices, high food prices, some are doing very well. And it's because a few corporations are making off like bandits. And in particular, as you mentioned, it's not only the fossil fuel companies, it also includes some of the digital giants that are doing very well. Some of the food companies are doing very well. When we think in economics about compensation, and what determines what various individuals, companies get, there are two broad theories. One of them is that rewards are related to contributions, and that's sometimes called just desserts. And those of you who have had to suffer in economics know it's called marginal productivity theory. And the idea is that individuals get compensated according to their marginal product, and it's supposed to be related to their social marginal product. The income that our oil companies are getting, our food companies are getting today has nothing to do with what they've done. They should send a thank you note to Putin, but it's not a result of their efforts that the prices have gone up. These are literally windfall profits, and totally undeserved. The implication of that is that there is really no justification for not taxing them. Now, one has to be a little bit, one of the lessons that we had windfall profits taxes in the United States back in the 70s when the oil prices went way up, and some of those taxes were not well designed. One has to be very careful in the design of these taxes. If you are very careful in designing it, you can actually both raise a lot of revenue and get prices not to go up and actually encourage investment. So I think that's what Europe should be doing. That's what the U.S. should be doing. Now, I should add, Europe is facing an additional problem, much worse than the United States, but United States, you see it in a more limited form, and I think thinking about the United States helps illustrate what is at issue here. The United States is basically energy neutral. So what has been going on globally, shortage of oil, has very little effect on the United States. We are energy neutral. So what has happened? What has happened is there has been, within the United States, a massive redistribution from energy, from ordinary consumers to the rich energy companies. That's all it is. It's just a redistribution. Why? because we've linked our prices to global prices. There was no reason we had to do that. We could have organized our economy in a different way, where we were not linked to international prices. If we were delinked from international prices, it would have had us a cost in normal times, but in abnormal times, and we are effectively at war, and at wartime, almost no country relies on ordinary economics. But Europe and the United States are pretending that we're not at war. Now, it's not our young people who are dying in Ukraine, but there is a war, and we have a lot at stake in that war in Ukraine. But while the Ukrainians are dying, we're not doing our part financially, economically. Now, the structure of markets in Europe, in the energy market in Europe, was always, I thought, a little bit foolish. But the real weakness is being exhibited right now because, you know, take a country like Norway, where they're large energy exporter, gas and hydroelectric. They linked their energy prices to the rest of Europe. And so what's happening? Here's a country who's a massive energy exporter, and yet ordinary households in Norway are facing increases of electric bills of tenfold. And that is because of the way they've organized the economic market, all based on principles of neoliberalism that exaggerate the benefits of allocation that comes from using marginal pricing, cost pricing, but totally underestimate the social cost of the redistribution that comes as a result. And right now, because it was so badly organized, there is a potential of a financial crisis because there are so many derivatives based on these prices, and massive bankruptcies of companies that are perfectly good companies, except they made a mistake of buying or selling derivatives. So Europe is really facing a crisis where revenues of the kind that would be raised by a windfall profits tax are absolutely essential. So raising that revenue to protect particularly ordinary citizens from what I would say is a massive mistake in economic organization of the energy market is absolutely essential.
Thank you very much. And you have already answered to my second question, so that's very nice, very kind. So no, that's perfect. That's perfect. That's perfect. The rules were very strict on me, but not on you. But Professor Ghosh, again, you have both said that austerity is not the answer. You have been constantly insisting we can't repeat the mistakes of the past. Do governments have a choice? That's a real question because of the pressure you have said, Professor Stiglitz. But what are precisely ICRICT recommendations to avoid austerity?
I think, should I, let me use this, it might just be, Yes, thank you. Well, you know, austerity was never a good choice. I mean, it was always this enormous con that we were fed, right? That what's the basic principle? That you cut down your public spending, never that you increase taxes. You cut down public spending to reduce deficits or keep everything in a fiscally disciplined way. Private capital will get so excited they'll come rushing to your country and give you growth, and that is going to generate all the other good stuff that happens. We knew that that never worked. It has been shown over and over again that it doesn't work, and yet the same old medicine gets recommended every time. Finally, whose interest does it serve? It serves the interests of large capital. And we've seen this now. I mean, I think even those of you who are very young in here will remember when you were in school, the global financial crisis, right? And so what happened? Finance made a big, they're even, oh my God. Guys, seriously? You were not even in school? Okay, anyway, all right. Your parents will have told you about the global financial crisis. So what happened? Basically, finance, particularly in the US, but all over, messed up big time, right? What happens? They get bailed out by the governments, particularly in the advanced economies. What happens, especially in Europe, after they bail out finance, is that they run deficits. Once finance has recovered, what does it do? It says, you can't run those deficits, shame on you. Cut your spending. And so, you have all kinds of austerity imposed, particularly, let's talk about the Eurozone crisis in the Eurozone periphery, okay? We have been through this over and over and over again. I remember early 2000s, there was a lot of talk about increased inequality. And many people, including Thomas, who is, could not be here this evening, have brought out incredibly impressive work on inequality. Since then, inequality has gone up, maybe tripled since then. Each crisis is one which leads to even greater inequality. So what's going on out here? It's really that there is a massive ability of big capital to influence public decision-making, and then I believe through the media to influence public attitudes to that public decision-making, which somehow make us all think austerity is the only response, higher interest rates are the only response to an inflation, austerity is the only response to any crisis. Anything happens that's bad, cut public spending. So let me, again, sort of parallel Joe's earlier comments. Will a cut in public spending improve the food crisis in most of the developing world? Will a cut in public spending generate more employment in developing countries? Will a cut in public spending resolve the problems of agriculture or the impact of climate change? No, they will make it all worse. And in fact, that's precisely what's happening. We are intensifying these problems so that we're actually reaching tipping points in each of these. So clearly, austerity is not the answer. What is the answer? Well, we've already said, one obvious thing, you have to increase spending. It's interesting that the rich countries got this immediately. The pandemic hits, they have to do a lockdown, they say, oh my God, we got to increase public spending. Suddenly, finance didn't have a problem with that. Money comes out of a hat. Why can't developing countries pull money out of a hat? Because we have, unfortunately, not got globally acceptable reserve currencies. And so when we pull the money out of the hat, we have all kinds of problems, either with our balance of payments or with our external debt or with global capital markets who look at us and say, you can't run a deficit. Shame on you. India, we were one of the most restricted countries in the world during the pandemic. Literally increased our spending by 1% of GDP additional in real terms, okay? Nothing, considering that 95% of our workers are informal. The social protection is laughable. Desperate conditions that we created in the pandemic. But because our revenues fell in the pandemic, our fiscal deficit was larger, kind of obvious, right? Fiscal deficit to GDP ratio was even larger because the GDP fell. So immediately, we get a credit rating downgrade threat because our fiscal deficit to GDP ratio is larger. Now, it was nowhere near what the US or Europe or anyone else was doing, but it was large, and we're a developing so-called emerging market. So it's unacceptable. So this is the condition, that we cannot actually currently engage in proactive fiscal spending without inviting the wrath of finance, okay? That's the reality. So how do we avoid that? The only way we can avoid that is by generating our own revenues. And as we've been saying, and as ICRICT has been saying, there are ways to generate revenues. We have multinationals operating in our countries that are making millions and billions in profits on our soil, which are not paying even 2%. We can actually bring about changes that ensure we get at least some of that as our own taxes. We have extremely wealthy individuals, and they don't put all their money in tax havens. They actually keep some of it even in our own countries. We can, in fact, tax some of that wealth. And as we get more country-by-country reporting, we can begin to tax some of the wealth that is outside as well. You don't even need, we've had wonderful numbers being indicated. You don't need very large proportions. You can tax at 1%, 2%, and you get pretty large amounts. There was one estimate done for India. If you tax just the 965 richest families in the country, not even 1,000, 965 families, you tax 4% of their wealth. This is just at the beginning of the pandemic. You get 1% of GDP. Our health budget is less than that. For central and state governments together, our health budget is less. So we would more than double our health budget by just taxing 4% of the wealth of 965 families. They wouldn't even notice that 4%, right? So there is, in fact, a huge possibility for progressive taxation. In ICRICT, we have been discussing, and we have a statement coming out tomorrow, which is suggesting various options for developing countries. Of course, we would love a multilateral solution. And of course, we were all waiting for a multilateral solution. While we're waiting, shall we say, while we're waiting, we cannot afford to do nothing. So we are suggesting that developing countries go out there and do things, and there are things they can do. They can actually go out there and do, you can't call them unilateral measures because only the US gets to do that, but they can do alternative measures, which will actually bring in tax revenues and which operate on the new technical knowledge that has been provided by the OECD inclusive process, by the fact that we now know a lot more about who has money, where it is held, whether country by country reporting is, where it's available. We can actually use that knowledge and the technical knowledge that is provided during all of these negotiations to bring in taxes that we would not otherwise have been able to do, and which can then provide, I mean, I cannot tell you how desperately this money is needed, way beyond anything you can imagine. And of course, then we have to get our governments, not all of whom are that responsive or democratic or accountable, but we have to get them to spend it properly. That's another discussion. Yeah, but definitely, yes, we have to do that.
Thank you very much, both of you. I just want to ask you if you can add something. I mean the main argument, because you can have heard the UN Secretary General said that the windfall profits are immoral. We heard both of you, I think you agree, but what the other argument to say it's not a problem for the recovering of economy to tax these windfall profits and to continue? I think we need more arguments, because in France, the debate around this issue is very hot, actually.
Yeah, this just reflects the success of a lot of, in the business community and maybe a failure in economics, to argue that taxes on profits discourage investment, discourage employment, and so forth. You have to remember, profit taxes are taxes on profits. And the nature of, if you're maximizing your profits, or you're maximizing 0.8 times profits, or 0.5 times profits, you do exactly the same thing. So the basic idea is that a true profits tax, and what we've evolved is very close, because you deduct capital, you deduct wages, you deduct every cost. So it is a really close to a pure profits tax. Does not affect investment, does not affect employment. There is a little bit of tax competition, and that can move firms from one country to another. And one of the big contributions of the BEPS process is to try to address that race to the bottom, and it's one of the things that ICRICT has been working on from the start. So I think that's really important. But that is the only issue. And I know the discussion in France is not just about capital moving in and out. It is really that it discourages investment, and that's just wrong. They should read a good textbook, I wrote a good article about it. And so that's what the economics is, and it is so, You could understand why if you were in a corporation, you would make these arguments. You know, you want to scare people and say, "Don't tax me." You know, if you do that, the world is going to be the end of the world. So I understand that rhetoric, but what I don't understand is how many people have fallen for it. And I don't understand why governments that try to pretend that they're working in the interest of ordinary individuals seem to buy it sometimes, other than maybe they aren't really working in the interest of everybody in society. Then maybe that's an alternative explanation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, both of you. And the discussion will continue with the two other speakers and with Susanna. Thank you very much for the tone of this discussion.
Thank you, Cécile. And we're running out of time.
Microphone.
Sorry, we're running out of time a little bit, but because the discussion is intense and important. But when I was hearing the conversation, in fact, the global deal at the OECD and the G20 was initiated in part as a response to the previous financial crisis, also to the context. So we are almost 10 years later, and then we need to understand if we're just repeating things, and if we're heading somewhere. So first we'll hear Theresa Neef from the EU Tax Observatory to present sharply and shortly what is the deal about. And then we'll have also Pascal Saint-Amans, the head of tax at the OECD, still for some weeks, to let us understand what is this process going ahead. Thank you, Theresa.
Thank you, Susanna. I hope with my presentation I can bridge a bit the two panel discussions coming from basically the need of having the need of fiscal space, and that there are different measures we can take, to basically the specific international tax reform we have right now the global minimum tax under Pillar 2, which was actually agreed upon already among more than 130 jurisdictions under the OECD's inclusive framework. And I hope with my presentation I can set the ground a bit to say what it is about, so what are the main mechanisms, how it came about, and based on a study we conducted with some colleagues from the EU Tax Observatory, we estimated the revenue potential of this reform, so to see how much fiscal space it can create. And then I would like to lead into the discussion with some questions that I would like to hear what you think about them. So let me start by setting the context, by just showing you two observations from recent economic research. The first one is that about 36% of multinational profits are shifted to tax havens globally in recent years. So more than a third. That means most of those profits are usually shifted from high tax countries to low tax countries, and this decreases the tax burden of the corporations. The second observation from this very recent study is that between 1985 and 2018, the global average statutory corporate tax rate fell by about half. It was 49% in 1985, and today it is about 24%. And those two phenomena are very closely linked. Digitalization and globalization have made it very difficult to really pinpoint where the revenue or the value added is created. And that makes it possible for many corporations, big multinational corporations, to shift their profits from high tax countries where production is actually taking place to low tax jurisdictions. And this erodes basically the tax base of those high tax countries, because they have less profit they can tax. At the same time, and in the absence of a multilateral solution there, many countries actually decreased their tax rates because they wanted that the profit shifting was less profits were shifted out of their countries, so they thought if we offer lower tax rates, maybe less profits are shifted out. And at the same time, some countries actually actively engaged in tax competition. They tried to attract investments, they tried to boost their employment by offering lower tax rates to those corporations. So all those, basically all those phenomena led to this so-called race to the bottom of corporate income tax rates. And the countermeasure we have now basically almost It's still, we'll see. This is what the discussion will be about afterwards. Is the global minimum tax, which is supposed to stop this race to the bottom. And I want to show you just the main mechanisms of this global minimum tax for a moment, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions, actually. So here we have the framework, which I just mentioned already. There's a corporate group headquartered in a high-tax country. And this corporate group, to decrease their tax bill, shifts profits to a subsidiary they have in a low-tax country. Let's assume that in this low-tax country, they paid 10% of their profits in taxes. So the effective tax rate is 10%. So lower than this 15% global minimum tax that was agreed upon. So what does the global minimum tax actually do there? So I will only show you two rules. There's a whole set of rules, but I think I only show you the two most important for the revenue potential. And the first one is the domestic tax. Under the domestic tax in this agreement, the local tax office, on top of the 10% they are already taking or already taxing, they also collect a top-up tax, which is the difference between the 15% and the 10%. So they're levying a 5% top-up tax, which goes to the government of the low-tax country. However, if the low-tax country, for example, says, well, we don't implement this deal, then they won't collect this top-up tax. And then another mechanism kicks in, which is the income inclusion rule. This was actually the main rule in the agreements in July and October. Only in the model rules in December of 2021, this domestic tax came in. But this income inclusion rule was before the main mechanism. Then if the low-tax country does not collect the 5% top-up tax, it's not lost. The multinational has to pay the 15%. It pays 10% in the low-tax country, and then the headquarters country can levy the 5% top-up tax, which leads to a 15% tax burden for the multinational corporation here. So those are the main mechanisms.
There is another one.
Sorry, there is just another one, which is if the headquarter country doesn't do it, and if the tax haven doesn't do it, but it's not only tax havens, we'll go back to that, then the source country can do it. So you have, it's a razor with three blades, actually, which means that you have a pretty tight net. So just to add, because the third layer is as important, I think. Sorry.
Yeah. Yes, but I will come to it later.
At the bottom are the developing countries that are the source countries. Let's be clear.
Nope, but we'll go back to that.
Okay.
Okay, I'm happy that I'm already steering a debate here. Let me just go quickly through what we found, because now I want to come to actually our study that shows the fiscal space it can create, so the revenues. And this is a cooperation between Mona Barake, Puleman Ilchuk, and Gabriel Sukman and me. And we actually tried to estimate the revenue potential of this global minimum tax. And we find that this global minimum tax, if it is broadly implemented by all the countries that agree to it, it can lead to an additional 155 billion euros per year globally. Now, the question is, who will receive or collect those 155 billion euros? And this distribution of the revenues depends heavily on which rule is applied and who implements the tax. So let's say only the headquarter countries collect, which was basically the rule in July and October. Then the rich countries will collect most of the revenues. And this was a broad criticism in the last year. We find that the EU would gain 55 billion euros per year and the US the same amount. However, with the new domestic tax, which came in December, only in the model rules, the subsidiary countries can collect, and then the revenues are slightly more balanced. Just to give you some numbers, so here we, in this table, we use the UN classification to classify countries by developing, and transition, etc. And in the middle column, you see the headquarters country collect the revenue. And there, yes, there's the criticism. Most of the revenues go to the developed countries, and particularly to the G7, because most of the headquarters of big corporations are in the G7 countries. However, with the new rule, with the qualified domestic minimum top-up tax, as it is called, the revenues are a bit more balanced. Particularly the G7 countries would gain much less, and developing countries would gain a bit more here. Just another point I want to raise, because I think it is very important, are carve-outs. So it's the question, does the policy actually provide a solid floor for corporate tax rates? So is 15% really the solid floor? And the answer is no, not completely, because of those substance-based carve-outs. Those are basically provisions that can reduce the profits that are subject to this minimum tax by 5% of the payroll costs and the tangible assets. And what are their effects? Well, first of all, they reduce the potential revenue, the fiscal space, substantially. We find that they reduce the revenues for EU countries by 18%. So our benchmark, like if the deal was implemented as it is laid out now with the carve-outs, we find that the EU would gain 55 billion euros per year. Without the carve-outs, if in the future at some point carve-outs would be scratched, this could go up to 67 billion euros. And the same is true for our revenue estimates globally. So if in the future carve-outs would be scratched, then we could gain actually much more revenue. So those are the 2 points I find very important. What is the distribution of revenues, and that 15% is not a solid floor yet. And with this, I would like to lead into the discussion. So this agreement was very much celebrated because basically more than 130 jurisdictions came together under the OECD's inclusive framework and agreed upon the main characteristics of this global minimum tax. However, it was also highly criticized for the points I just mentioned. The distribution of the revenues, the tax rate was for some countries too low, and also the carve-outs. But more important right now, it seems, is that to access basically the revenue potential you just saw, is that we implement this deal more broadly and globally, so that many countries actually sign on to this deal. And even though in 2021, everything seemed to move very swiftly with the 2 statements that showed that so many countries agreed, like the main obstacle right now is that all the countries that agree to it have to sign those rules into their national laws. And this is where the process is currently stagnating. You've probably heard about it. In the US, it has not passed the Senate. In the EU, it has not passed the Council yet. But on the other side, there's hope. In the last weeks, we have seen that there's a coalition of the willing, especially among EU countries, that would like to implement the deal. And so 2 questions that came out of this reflection I just presented is, can the implementation of the few actually incentivize the many? So there's this argument also about the under-tax payments rule that Mr. Saint-Amans just made, that if some countries don't sign on to the deal, say the US don't sign on to the deal, then the countries implementing the deal can actually collect the revenue of the non-implementing countries. And here it is very important, how strong is this incentive? Is that really enough of an incentive that everyone in the end signs on? And the second question for broad global or international implementation is that also many developing countries sign on. And so that the revenues also get a bit more balanced in their distribution globally. So where do developing countries actually stand there in terms of implementation? Do they face different obstacles than developed countries do? Are they actually still prone to implement this deal into national law? And I would like to hear your insights on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Theresa. Okay, let's start with Pascal. Now we have an understanding of what the deal is. What is it about? Okay, let's. I'm so sorry. No, it's okay. But the thing what's going to happen is still the deal, because the politics, the implementation, as Theresa was saying, it's important. So where are we? Is it still alive, the deal? Is it going to happen?
Thank you, Susanna. Good evening to you all. The deal is more alive than the poor microphone, which was killed in front of us half an hour ago. Listen, very good presentation, very good questions. Just before responding, I would like, if you allow me, 2 comments on what was said in the previous roundtable. First, energy, at least electricity market. If we didn't have an ideology that the market solves all the problem, we would have better regulation of the electricity market. What's happening is crazy, is stupid. It happened in California back in 2000. Exactly. I recommend you to read a very good book, EDF Chronique d'un désastre inéluctable, which explains why the regulation doesn't work. I wrote it back in 2003, and it's interesting to see that it describes today's situation. So just an aside, I'm not only a tax guy. Second, tax to GDP must be improved, higher in developing countries. The level is much too low to ensure development. We're in full agreement with that. What are the tools? Progressive taxation, capital taxation. It's striking that developing countries do not tax capital income. They do not tax capital gains. They do not tax dividends. It's a shame. There is no progressivity of any kind to be solved. And that's a domestic issue which can be solved. Finally, corporate income tax. Yes, there is a contribution. The only nuance I would add is it's not going to solve the problem of development. So let's not oversell the capacity of solving development problems with corporate income tax money. That's not what you said, but that's what we can hear. No, I'm saying it, but that's what we can hear here and there. Now, on the Pillar 2 and the global deal, is it alive? I think so. I think so. Now, you can look at it in a very dubious, suspicious manner, saying, well, the US didn't do it, Europe didn't do it, and other countries will be waiting. This is, I think, the wrong approach. The real approach is that Pillar 2 is a devilish mechanism, and that's how we, the villains at the OECD, conceived it. It doesn't require a multilateral solution. It's about unilateral measures which are coordinated, which articulate with each other, but you don't need everybody to move. And actually, if you have a first mover which is big enough, you have a domino effect. The other countries are incentivized to move. Now, let's take the real case right now. Europe has failed because our dear friends from Poland or our dear friends from Hungary, quote unquote, have not agreed to join the deal when they had agreed to join the deal at the OECD. So they don't hold to their word. So be it. What can happen? Well, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, and many others can implement the OECD rules which have been translated into a draft directive. Not very complicated. It's unilateral measures. It's domestic legislation. They can do it. They will do it. Once these countries have moved, introducing this global minimum tax of 15%. And there, that's what we call the income inclusion rule. The headquarter country will tax. What will happen? All the American companies operating in Europe and shifting their profit to Bermuda, or it has reduced following the US tax reform, we must say. But still, they're shifting massively profits outside of Europe. The Europeans are going to take it. They're going to suck American taxes. What will the Republicans in the US say? It's very un-American to leave our taxing rights to the European. They're going to move. They're going to be the first ones to move. Once you have Europe and the US, the others are moving. And by the way, Canada wants to move, Japan wants to move, Indonesia wants to move, Brazil wants to move. Switzerland is moving whatsoever. They're changing their constitution to implement this top-up tax of 15%. Which drives me to, so is it happening? Yes, it is happening. I would like, because it's very complicated, and you said it yourself, and there are many misconceptions. So just give me 2 more minutes to point to 2 very important aspects of Pillar 2. The first one is you mentioned low-tax countries, right? We're thinking of tax havens, Cayman, Bermuda, zero-tax countries. But actually, what you're missing, and probably also in the numbers, because we're missing them too. We're not able, I have a team of economists working on that. We cannot crack the numbers there. Among the low-tax countries there, you have almost all countries around the world, the high-tax countries. Developing countries are giving away several percentages points of GDP to tax incentives. They do not tax mining industries because they've been pressured by these industries to provide for tax incentives. The top-up tax primarily can be implemented
by developing countries and others which have tax incentives. And that's where, you know, the first rule is not actually the income inclusion rule. It's the countries which gave up their taxing right to other countries, and nobody has thought of that really so far. So I invite you to think of that and to advise developing countries which tend to disregard Pillar 2, and I think they have a lot to gain. Now, it's true that they are going to lose the capacity of using tax incentives to attract investment, and they are concerned. And that's why developing countries in the deal ask for this carve-out, to say we still need, when there is real substance, to attract some companies. And I think it's fair enough. I mean, you know, Pillar 2 is about, I want to grab the money, but also I want you know, like the gamblers in casino who are completely addicted, at some point they signal themselves to the police and to the casino authorities and they're not allowed to get in the casino. Here it's the same. Pillar 2's logic is, if I provide tax incentives, another country is going to suck it out of my country. Is going to take the tax. And as a result, it kind of prevents me of introducing tax incentives. And this is a very important dimension, in particular for developing countries. The last remark, two last remarks. One is, in addition of all that, we have an agreement that there will be a subject to tax rules. It's a bit technical, but it's a mechanism to fix tax treaties from developing countries, which too often gave up taxing right to tax haven, to Mauritius and others. The first rule which we'll implement is the subject to tax rule. We still need to design the scope. Finally, the revenue which is at stake. You said 155 billions, we said 150 billions, we're fully aligned. What I can say is that the team had access to more recent data, and we'll come up in the week of 7th of October with numbers, and I can tell you that when you see the profit of the large multinational companies, we're talking here about the companies above 750 million euros of turnover, right? 9,000 companies in the world. When you look at the trajectory of the profit, is skyrocketing, which means that the profit, I mean the revenue from Pillar 2 is increasing enormously. So we are in numbers which are significantly higher. As regards the distribution, I have no clue. And I stop with that. I have no clue, because will developing countries introduce this top-up tax or not? That has a massive impact. They take the tax or they leave it to the headquarter countries. So I don't know. What will happen in tax havens? Not clear. Maybe some of them will keep the investments. In Switzerland, they will keep some stuff because you have a good environment and you have many other reasons than the tax reason. In Bermuda or elsewhere, will they keep the investment? Probably not. So there is a real question there which is unclear. So the distribution, I don't know, but I concur with what you say. It's not as unbalanced to developing countries as it was initially thought, and we're very happy with that. I stop. Thank you.
Thanks, Pascal. It's going to be great to see those figures, finally. Not too late. Because at some point, for many countries, it was like giving a blank check when endorsing the deal. So it's never too late, but it's making things very complicated in politics, Pascal. So let me...
Estoy de acuerdo contigo.
Es imposible no estarlo. So let me start. I mean, Pascal is always optimistic on the real politics. Do you think, Joe, that this domino effect that is really going to happen? And if Europe, I mean, at this stage, we have a political impasse in Europe. Okay, it's Hungary blocking, 5 countries saying we're going unilateral, so we can say unilateral when it's following the OECD, but not when it's for alternative measures. So this is important in semantics also. But we have 5 countries saying what they want to do, but they have not been doing that. So do we really think that this domino effect is going to motivate the US and will have that happening in the US? Because without the US, the final effect of the implementation of Pillar 2 is less optimistic than what Pascal was saying.
Yeah, let me say, I think it's enormously complicated, and it's complicated not just by the politics, but you might say by history, because one of the problems of the, talking about the developing countries not fully exercising their taxing rights is that many countries in the past have signed these very bad agreements called investment agreements. And the investment agreements tie their hands to not raising the tax rate. And that means that sort of the rosy scenario, if we were starting from a blank slate, I think rationality would say, let's not have the race to the bottom. The evidence, to go back a second, that there's very little evidence that this tax competition actually induces much investment, and that it is correctly described as a race to the bottom, where the main beneficiary are the corporations who have induced this race to the bottom. And you know, if you think about it systemically, it's not like there's globally that much more investment. It's all a question of where it locates. It's moving from one place to another. So if you looked at the macro statistics, there is no benefit from this. And in fact, it's a loss, because in that race to the bottom, the tax rates gets lower, and it's just a redistribution towards a redistribution to the companies. Now, this is where answering your question gets really complicated, because those companies are very influential in the United States, and they like the race to the bottom. And the main reason that the United States passed a we passed a corporate minimum tax based on, not on the OECD model, but based on another variant, and we have, it's complex, but the reason was not because they were concerned about developing countries. I can tell you that. It was really that they were worried about money leaving the United States to low-tax jurisdictions. And the interesting thing is, it even occurred under Trump. I mean, that is the striking thing, that even under Trump, there was an attempt to recoup some of that tax revenue. Why? Well, in that particular case, it was a political battle. Trump wanted to have a lower tax rate for corporations in general, not for these firms that were engaged in tax avoidance. And he wanted to lower the tax rates on billionaire individuals. He wanted to really have a good regressive tax reform. And he didn't want to have more than a few $1 trillion of increase in the deficit. So, you know, in this world, he had to look for money where he could find it, and the easiest prey were the multinationals who were in the tax havens. That drama may play out again. We are in need of more revenue, and so something along that line could actually eventually get us to a good minimum tax. But let me just finally say something that ICRICT's view has been very strong on. 15% is just too low, because when we started this whole enterprise, it was about increasing tax revenues. And there is a real risk that the minimum actually become the norm or the maximum. It's a coordinating variable. And so if that happened, actually, the aggregate tax revenues, which have been going down from corporations, which have been going down, will be even lower, and the developing countries will have an even harder time getting the revenue that they need.
Thank you. I'm conscious about time. I know Pascal has to leave, so let me make a second question to Pascal, and then we'll get back to Jayati. But so we have the US with an alternative minimum tax. We have the European Union still unclearly some countries vetoing, and it's only on Pillar 2. What will happen? I mean, do you still think that on Pillar 1, which is about taxing rights, do we have a chance to get a deal on there? And if not, ICRICT has been calling on countries to not sit and wait what happens, but to move into alternative measures, not to call it unilateral, alternative measures. But OECD has said that it's impossible. How we can rebalance? No?
No.
Oh, wow. Go.
Thank you. So for those who are not that familiar, the deal reached on the 8th of October by 137 countries has two pillars. We've just talked about what I think is the most important one and the most urgent one, which is to put a minimum tax. And 15% may sound like not that high a rate, and Joe will agree that we're talking here about an effective tax rate, not a nominal rate. So an effective tax rate of 15% brings us closer to a nominal rate of 25 and above. So it's not something which is low. Effective means you don't look at the tax account which are manipulated. You look at the consolidated financial profit, you look at the tax effectively paid or due, and you do the ratio. So that's just to nuance. I'm not debating the fact that you can have views to increase the rate. Now, the agreement included Pillar 1. If there is a Pillar 2, logically there is a Pillar 1. And Pillar 1 is about addressing the tax challenges of the digitalization of the economy. In other words, countries have been frustrated to see tech giants operating on their territory without having a physical base. Since the League of Nations, which created the current system a century ago, you need to be physically present, brick and mortar economy, logical. Now, no longer the case, and countries were frustrated not to be able to tax the hundreds of billions of profit derived by these tech companies from their territory. So Pillar 1 is trying to provide a solution, and this solution says for the companies, not only the tech companies, that's very important. It's true for pharmaceutical, it's true for semiconductors, it's true for shipping. We're not talking about shipping. Shipping companies are now getting richer than Amazon and the others, right, given the crisis. For all these companies, they should allocate part of their rent, a quarter of the rent, defined as above 10% profitability. So the big money they make, they should reallocate it to the markets where the consumers are. Because the only thing you cannot manipulate if you're a company is where your customers, where your clients are, right? And a quarter of the rent would go to the markets, whether you're physically present or not. What is different from P1 and P2 is that P1 needs all the countries to be on board, in particular the US, where you have all the most juicy multinational companies in the world. If the US doesn't participate, there is little chance that it goes anywhere. We're building Pillar 1. There is an agreement on the features, and we have until mid-23 to design the precise features of Pillar 1. Now, and you will smile when I spell it out, for Pillar 1 to get into force, you need a multilateral convention, and for a multilateral convention to enter into force, you need 67 senators in the US to sign on. It's not smile, it's laughters that I can hear. And we've known that since the beginning. The chance of this to get through is very small, right? But we're still working on it, and let me say two additional comments so that you understand the background. One, this deal actually in the US is bipartisan. You just said it. I mean, interestingly, the tax reform in the US was done by Trump for not necessarily good reasons, but the global minimum tax was introduced by the Tax Reform Act under Trump in December 17. It's called GILTI. But they also introduced the idea that you should give more taxing right to the market jurisdictions. Okay? So this Pillar 1 is a bipartisan idea. Two, you don't have many American companies in scope, 40 plus, which are in scope, which means that the lobbying effort in the Senate will be smaller than if you have thousands of American companies in scope. Three, and more importantly, I would say, if it doesn't go through, if in July there is a failure. The US doesn't ratify what we will have decided. And what the US said was right, because on the 8th of October last year, they said the current allocation of taxing right is wrong. They almost said ICRICT is right. No, they didn't say so. But we were almost there, saying it's wrong. So countries will have kind of a green light to try to grab their taxing rights. Now, I would caution countries against DSTs, because who does pay the DST? It's not Amazon. It's the poor guy at the end of the chain on which the cost of the tax will be passed on. And it's demonstrated. I mean, Amazon said it, and many others are doing it. So we need to be careful about the amount of money and the incidence here, because that's a real issue. I'm not saying countries are not entitled to do it, and probably if it fails, they should do it. And if they do it, what's going to happen? A complete mess. Trade tensions, trade wars, which will bring countries, including the US, back to the table, which makes me think that on the 8th of October last year, we turned the page. There is a new page to be written. It will happen. It may take more time than Pillar 2, which is going to happen in the coming months. Pillar 1 may take more time. I still don't exclude a miracle. 67 senators in a bipartisan matter chanting the glory of multilateral solutions. Maybe I'm pushing a bit there. But Pillar 1 will happen at the end of the day.
Thank you, Pascal. Jayati, we're talking about a global deal with 137 countries endorsing it, but all the time about what the US and what the European Union are doing and how their position is, in fact, helping into the implementation or not. What happens with developing countries?
So Pillar 1, let's face it, I mean, yes, it was endorsed by 137 countries, many of them kicking and screaming, many of them with great resignation, many of them realizing there's nothing in it for them, really. Because the way Pillar 1 was eventually, I mean, the idea of unitary taxation, which is something ICRICT has been asking for years, is absolutely great, and it's precisely what we wanted. The way it was watered down in terms of only the residual so-called profits to be covered, only about 100 companies globally to be covered, only 25% of those profits to be shared, et cetera, meant that developing countries would get a pittance, maybe, I don't know, 10, 11 billion, various estimates. So yeah, there was really not much in it for developing countries. And then, of course, they would have to agree to give up any of those independent measures. I mean, Pascal doesn't like digital service taxation, but it gives some money, for God's sake, you know?
Yeah,
I mean, which they're getting zero at the moment.
Paid by the poor people, not by the companies.
No. You can, in fact, design it differently so it's not. And in many countries, and in India, for example, it's not paid by the poor people right now, because Amazon is desperate to enter the Indian market, and it is facing Indian competition, so it has not raised prices. So. Not yet.
India is a bigger market than many
countries,
yes,
right? But sure. But what I'm trying to say is that, in fact, therefore, it's not the case that it is always paid by the poor people. That's what Amazon will try and tell you, but it's not true. But I think more to the point, the issue is this. And I think that's why I really liked what you said, Pascal, because what you're really saying is go unilateral. You basically said that. You said wait till next October, but, you know, we'll give you that one. We won't necessarily wait till next October. You're saying go unilateral. That's the only way to get guys back on the negotiating table for a decent agreement. I think what is really emerging from all of this is that, of course, everybody would prefer a multilateral solution. I mean, of course, I'm a deep multilateralist at heart. Developing countries need multilateralism because otherwise you get picked out individually by the big bullies in the block. So sure, we all want multilateral. If the multilateral is really not going to give you much and is going to deny you any autonomy in terms of your own domestic taxing rights, and is going to subject you to arbitration, which we all know where that one goes, maybe it's not worth it, okay? So maybe it's just as well that 67 senators are never going to stand up and say, you know, we're going with this one. Maybe we actually go with our own measures, which take off from the excellent work done by the inclusive process in terms of identifying where profits are made, identifying where sales happen, identifying the employment and assets everywhere, identifying how much different rates would generate. I mean, that's fabulous work that developing countries can use. So maybe now developing countries should take all that knowledge and go out there and not stick to 15%. Think of a formulary apportionment of profits on their own. Go ahead and do that on their own, and maybe with the domestic tax rate. In other words, I think right now what you're really saying is all options are open, and I think that's fantastic, because I think that's what developing countries need right now. We need all options open to be able to generate more tax revenues. And if that then helps the multilateral process, so much better. Yeah? Okay, you wouldn't let me get away with that.
Just what? Good point. But that's not what I said too. No, I would just like more. I mean, both technically and politically, for you all to go away. You can go unilateral on gross income. That's very easy. You put the tax on transaction. Then you have a question on the incidence, but it's easy. I mean, no treaty prevents you from doing that, but that's not smart taxation. Yeah. It's bad taxation, right? It's bad taxation. Yeah. And it can be regressive. Or you go on a net basis, taxing profits. Yeah. Very complicated. You can tax profit only through a multilateral solution, because otherwise you have a tax treaty. I mean, there are many reasons, objective reasons. I think we can all agree it's a fact. You cannot tax net outside a multilateral agreement. And that's the dilemma. If you go unilateral, you're stuck to gross taxation, which I think we all agree as tax specialists is not good. So there is no ideal situation where countries could go on their own and say, that's what I do. And it's true that India has some leverage that many African countries do not have because the size of the market.
But the African Union together can do something.
But they are not yet there, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we are really out of time. Thank you very much. We could stay still for ages, which means that the deal is raising a lot of interest, but no clarity, and it's been yes and no all the day. So thank you very much for being with us. Grand merci à tous our speakers today. Jayati and Joe Stiglitz, because they are the co-chairs of ICRICT, Theresa Neef from the EU Tax Observatory, and Pascal Saint-Amans, the head of tax at the OECD. And thank you very much for